There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that the worst atrocities in history were not carried out by obvious villains, but by ordinary people. People who once tucked their children into bed, who believed in right and wrong, who would have sworn they were incapable of cruelty. We like to imagine evil as something separate from us, a distant force wearing horns or hiding behind the eyes of a psychopath. But what if that's just a comforting illusion? What if, under certain circumstances, we are all capable of becoming the very monsters we fear? This is not just a philosophical question. It's a mirror held up to the darkest corners of the human psyche. It confronts us with the unsettling truth that decency is not a fixed trait, and that morality can unravel, sometimes slowly, sometimes in the blink of an eye, when the conditions are right. When we speak of the Lucifer Effect, we're not just referring to religious mythology, but to a psychological phenomenon, one that has haunted humanity throughout history and continues to shape our modern world in quiet, invisible ways. Coined by psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the Lucifer Effect explores how good people, you, me, the neighbor next door, can be seduced by situational forces and social pressures into committing acts of evil. The phrase references Lucifer, the angel who fell from grace not because he was born wicked, but because he defied, he disobeyed, he believed himself above his place. It is the story of transformation, of moral descent, of how someone can lose themselves one small compromise at a time. Why does this matter today? Because our world is not short on injustice, cruelty, and dehumanization. We see it on battlefields, in political systems, online comment sections, and even within families. And while it's easy to point fingers and distance ourselves, the truth is far more uncomfortable. The seeds of monstrosity lie dormant in all of us, waiting for the right soil to take root. This isn't a call for despair, it's a call for awareness. Because once we understand how ordinary people can become agents of harm, we also learn how to prevent it. We become more conscious of the environments we create, the power structures we participate in, and the subtle ways fear and obedience can corrode our sense of self. But this story isn't new. Long before Zimbardo conducted his infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, long before psychologists gave these dynamics a name, humanity wrestled with the question of inner corruption. From Greek tragedies to medieval confessions, from Buddhist teachings on ego to Sufi warnings about the nafs, the warning has always been there. The enemy is not always out there. Sometimes it's the face in the mirror. In this exploration, we will walk through the corridors of history, psychology, and personal reflection. Not to condemn, but to understand. To see clearly what we'd often rather ignore. And perhaps, by the end, we might come to see ourselves and each other with a deeper sense of humility, vigilance, and compassion. Are you ready to confront the shadows? To truly grasp how good people can become instruments of harm, we must begin not in the sterile laboratories of modern psychology, but in the dusty ruins of empires, in the blood-stained parchments of revolutions, in the whispered prayers of those caught between obedience and conscience. The transformation from decency to depravity is not a modern invention. It is a pattern, recurring, evolving, and yet eerily familiar each time it surfaces. The earliest stories humanity told reflect this archetypal fall from grace. In ancient Mesopotamia, the myth of Inanna's descent into the underworld painted a journey into darkness that was not punishment, but transformation. In the Hebrew scriptures, we meet Lucifer, the light-bearer, who falls not because of innate evil, but because of pride, rebellion, and a refusal to submit. This angel, once glorious, becomes the symbol of corruption, yet he does not become a monster overnight. His descent is the result of a decision, or perhaps a series of them, layered with emotion, desire, defiance. The Greeks gave us tragic figures like Oedipus and Agamemnon, men torn between fate and free will, whose downfall arose not from villainy, but from human flaws magnified by power and pressure. In ancient India, the Mahabharata depicts noble warriors like Karna, who, despite inner virtue, align themselves with the side of injustice out of loyalty, debt, or wounded pride. These stories are not simply about good and evil, but about the murky terrain between them, the subtle seductions that make betrayal feel righteous, or violence feel necessary. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and we find inquisitors burning innocents in the name of salvation. They believed they were saving souls. The violence was not senseless to them. It was sanctified. In Nazi Germany, bureaucrats signed documents that sent millions to their deaths, then went home and played with their children. In Rwanda, neighbors turned on neighbors, not out of some sudden burst of sadism, but because fear, propaganda, and tribal allegiance redefined morality in real time. In every historical moment where collective cruelty reigned, we find this tragic pattern. Ordinary individuals swept up in extraordinary circumstances. They are not empty vessels or mindless drones. Many are deeply conflicted. They rationalize. They compartmentalize. They convince themselves it is for the greater good, or that they had no choice, or that it isn't really their responsibility. What Zimbardo, Arendt, and others later called the banality of evil was not a new insight. It was the rediscovery of something ancient and terrifying, the realization that monstrosity can wear a familiar face. So how do cultures and philosophies explain this transformation? In Christian theology, sin is often described not simply as an act, but as a state, a drift away from divine alignment. Evil begins with small fractures, a glance, a thought, a compromise. The Desert Fathers spoke of logismoi, subtle thoughts that grow into passions and then actions. The idea was clear. The descent begins inside. In Islamic thought, the concept of the nafs, the ego self, offers a similar warning. The nafs al-amara is the self that commands to evil, the part of the soul easily seduced by pride, vengeance, or lust for control. But it is not irredeemable. Sufi mystics taught that the journey toward purification involves confronting this self with honesty and humility, recognizing that darkness exists within all of us, not to shame, but to transform. Eastern traditions, too, understood the inner seeds of destruction. In Buddhist philosophy, the causes of suffering, greed, hatred, and delusion, are not external demons, but internal poisons. A person overcome by them does not become evil in essence, but blind, and that blindness, when combined with power or fear, leads to immense suffering. These ancient frameworks saw moral collapse not as an on-off switch, but as a slow, often unconscious drift. And perhaps that's the most frightening part. Rarely does someone wake up and decide, "Today I will betray my values." Instead, they justify a lie, look the other way, silence their discomfort. Each act feels small, but over time they are reshaped. What's changed in the modern era is not the process, but the pace and reach of it. With the rise of nation-states, organized militaries, and mass propaganda, the conditions that enable the Lucifer Effect have been industrialized. Psychological manipulation is no longer the domain of cults or despots alone. It is embedded into political discourse, corporate culture, and even social media algorithms. Every system that rewards conformity and punishes dissent becomes a breeding ground for moral erosion. The 20th century gave us chilling examples. The Milgram Experiment, where participants believed they were delivering fatal electric shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure told them to. The Stanford Prison Experiment, where college students rapidly transformed into cruel guards or submissive prisoners. These were not monsters. They were students, volunteers, people like us. But this isn't just about history. It's about our lives right now. Think of the employee who witnesses unethical behavior at work but stays silent to protect their job. The group of friends who bully someone different to maintain their social hierarchy. The online mobs that dehumanize others behind the safety of anonymity. These are not abstract villains. They are us when we are tired, afraid or desperate to belong. Yet still, despite centuries of cautionary tales, we resist this truth. We cling to the idea that evil is out there, in criminals, in tyrants, in others. Perhaps it is too painful to admit how fragile our virtue can be. But until we do, we remain vulnerable. Because what history makes clear, again and again, is that the difference between good and evil is often not a chasm, but a line. A line that moves depending on the context, the narrative, the fear of punishment, or the promise of reward. And if we don't know where that line is in ourselves, we may not notice when we've crossed it. So let us no longer ask, how could they? Let us ask, under what conditions might I? Not to accuse ourselves, but to awaken. To stay human in a world that sometimes forgets how. To understand how good people can become agents of harm, we must walk into the heart of human psychology, the mechanisms that guide our behavior, often without our awareness. These are not just abstract theories, but living forces that shape the choices we make when no one is watching. In the right, or rather wrong, context, these forces can twist our values, manipulate our identities, and pull us further from our moral compass than we ever imagined possible. One of the foundational ideas here is situational influence, something most vividly demonstrated in Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. When average students were randomly assigned roles as either guards or prisoners, their identities began to dissolve. Within days, guards were abusing their power, humiliating and psychologically tormenting the prisoners. Zimbardo himself, acting as the prison superintendent, became blinded by the experiment's internal logic and failed to see the ethical disaster unfolding. This experiment was stopped not by the participants, not by the institution, but by an outsider who recognized that the people involved had lost sight of their humanity. What this experiment revealed, along with Milgram's earlier obedience studies, is that people are not evil in isolation. They often become so under the weight of authority, group pressure, and role expectation. These forces override individual conscience, not by silencing it completely, but by numbing it just enough to comply, to belong, or to avoid punishment. It is not that the people forget what is right. It is that they begin to see rightness through a distorted lens. This distortion has a name in psychology: cognitive dissonance. When our actions conflict with our beliefs, we experience mental discomfort. To ease that discomfort, we often change the belief to match the behavior, rather than confronting the unsettling truth about our actions. Imagine someone participating in discrimination. Rather than admit they are doing something wrong, they might begin to dehumanize the other group, seeing them as less deserving of empathy. This is how moral erosion begins, with small justifications, each one eroding the clarity of conscience. Then there is the bystander effect, the phenomenon where people are less likely to intervene in an emergency when others are present. The more people who witness wrongdoing, the less likely anyone is to act. Responsibility diffuses. Silence becomes the norm. In the most tragic cases, this silence enables horror, not because people are cruel, but because they feel powerless, uncertain, or afraid of standing out. But not all influence is external. There are internal forces at play, too, psychological structures that ancient thinkers also tried to name. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the rejected, unconscious part of ourselves that holds everything we deny or suppress. The shadow is not inherently evil, but it is powerful. When unacknowledged, it finds ways to manifest, sometimes through projection, sometimes through irrational anger, sometimes through acts we later barely recognize as our own. Jung warned that those who refuse to confront their own shadow are most likely to project it onto others, labeling them as the source of evil, hatred, or danger. This projection serves as a psychological defense, but it also creates fertile ground for conflict, persecution, and even violence. The most dangerous people, Jung suggested, are those who believe themselves to be wholly good. because they are blind to the darkness they carry. This idea was echoed centuries earlier in Sufi teachings. The mystics of the Islamic world spoke of the nafs, the ego self, which exists in different stages. The lowest, nafs al-amara, is the self that commands to evil. But it is not static. Through awareness, humility, and spiritual discipline, one can rise to nafs al-lawama, the self that blames itself, capable of reflection and repentance, and beyond that to nafs al-mutma'inna, the tranquil self, in harmony with higher truth. The journey of the nafs mirrors the journey through the shadow, not a battle to eradicate darkness but to integrate it, to transform it. From a modern psychological perspective, this process mirrors the development of moral reasoning, as described in Lawrence Kohlberg's stages. At the lowest level, we behave to avoid punishment or gain reward. Higher levels involve obedience to social norms. But true moral maturity, the post-conventional stage, requires acting from internal principles, even when they conflict with law, authority, or peer approval. Unfortunately, many people remain stuck in the earlier stages, especially when their environment rewards obedience over integrity. Add to this the power of identity fusion, a process where a person merges their sense of self with a group, and you have a recipe for both heroism and horror. A fused identity makes people willing to sacrifice their lives for the group, but it also makes them willing to harm outsiders if the group demands it. Soldiers, terrorists, activists, whistleblowers, all can act from the same underlying mechanism, directed by different values and narratives. This brings us to perhaps the most crucial concept: moral disengagement. Coined by psychologist Albert Bandura, this term refers to the mental strategies people use to disconnect from the ethical consequences of their actions. These strategies include euphemistic labeling, collateral damage instead of civilian deaths, displacement of responsibility, I was just following orders, and blaming the victim, they brought it on themselves. Each tactic allows a person to participate in harm without fully feeling like the perpetrator. And yet, there is something more ancient at play, something that transcends psychological terminology. In myth, we find stories of possession, of being taken over by a spirit or demon. Today, we might interpret this not as literal possession, but as symbolic, the ego overtaken by fear, by hatred, by the illusion of righteousness. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna stands on the battlefield, torn between duty and conscience. Krishna reminds him, the real war is not outside, but within. Every ethical decision is a battlefield. Every moment we act without reflection, the ego can seize control and justify its desires as necessity. But none of this means we are doomed. In fact, these insights give us power, because what psychology, philosophy, and ancient wisdom all agree upon is this: the descent into monstrosity is preventable, if we are willing to look honestly at ourselves. If we are willing to question our impulses, resist the comfort of groupthink, and choose discomfort over blind obedience. The human psyche is a vast, shadowed forest, and we all carry matches. The question is not whether darkness exists within us. The question is whether we have the courage to see it and the wisdom to keep it from spreading, because at the heart of every transformation is choice, sometimes subtle, sometimes painful, but always available. And it is in those choices, in how we respond to power, fear, and injustice, that the line between human and monster is drawn. While individual transformation is essential, it is also necessary to acknowledge the role of collective responsibility in preventing the Lucifer Effect from taking hold on a larger scale. Humans do not exist in isolation. Our actions ripple through the communities, organizations, and societies in which we live. This is particularly significant when discussing how good people turn into monsters. It is not just individual decisions that matter. It is the way those decisions are shaped by the systems we participate in, and, in turn, how those systems shape us. The influence of systems on morality. We often think of morality as an individual pursuit, a private matter between ourselves and our conscience. But the reality is that we are deeply influenced by the systems and structures around us. Whether we are part of a corporation, a political party, a religious group, or even a friendship circle, the norms of those systems shape the choices we make. Philip Zimbardo's famous Stanford Prison Experiment showed us the devastating effects of power imbalances and institutionalized roles. In this study, good people, college students, were randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners. Within days, the guards began to exhibit shocking levels of cruelty and dehumanization toward the prisoners, while the prisoners quickly internalized their victimhood. The experiment had to be stopped prematurely because the participants, though they had started as regular good people, had fallen so deeply into their roles that they became unrecognizable to themselves. Zimbardo's experiment sheds light on an uncomfortable truth. Our environment and the roles we are expected to play can push even the most well-meaning people toward unethical behavior. In fact, the structure of authority and conformity is often so powerful that it can overwrite personal moral codes. The concept of the banality of evil, coined by Hannah Arendt in her reporting on Adolf Eichmann's trial, suggests that evil is not always the work of monstrous individuals, but of ordinary people who blindly follow orders numb to the consequences of their actions. In other words, our moral failures are sometimes made possible not just by the choices we make in isolation, but by the systems that support or even encourage these choices. When we are part of a system that rewards unethical behavior, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain individual integrity. This is why we see the breakdown of morality not just in isolated incidents of personal failure, but as a collective phenomenon. In corrupt regimes, whether in politics, business, or social groups, individual accountability often becomes blurred. People justify unethical behavior because it is normalized, or worse, encouraged. Echoes of history. How systems have corrupted good people history is filled with examples of well-intentioned people falling prey to the influence of toxic systems. The atrocities of the 20th century, the Holocaust, Stalin's purges, the Rwandan genocide, were not carried out by a few evil men. These were collective tragedies, born from societal structures that dehumanized others and stripped individuals of their moral agency. For example, many ordinary Germans who participated in or enabled Nazi atrocities did not do so out of some inherent evil. They were caught in a web of political, cultural, and economic pressures that demanded their conformity. Through propaganda and fear, the Nazi regime created an environment where people were led to believe that their actions were not only justified, but necessary for the greater good. The system of Nazi ideology was so pervasive that it transformed the ordinary citizen into an agent of violence. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, ordinary people turned on one another in an atmosphere of fear and surveillance. Stalin's purges, in which millions were executed or sent to labor camps, were not only carried out by the state but by neighbors, friends, and colleagues who had been convinced to participate in the dismantling of their society's moral fabric. Just like the Stanford prison guards, these were not inherently bad people. They were ordinary citizens acting within a dehumanizing system that manipulated their sense of right and wrong. What we see, both in historical tragedies and in contemporary society, is that the systems we are part of, whether governmental, corporate, or social, shape our sense of morality. Good people, in many cases, do not turn into monsters out of malice, but out of conformity to a system that rewards unethical behavior. They are influenced by peer pressure, institutional authority, and the broader social norms that govern their lives. The collective awakening. How to break free. If the systems we are part of shape our morality, then they must also be part of the solution. Changing individual behavior is important, but it is only part of the equation. We need to examine, question, and transform the structures that perpetuate moral disengagement and inhumanity. This does not mean dismantling entire systems, but rather shifting the values that these systems prioritize. In the workplace, for example, we can push for a culture of integrity and transparency. In politics, we can demand accountability and honesty, supporting leaders who exemplify these values. In our communities, we can actively engage in conversations about justice and empathy, encouraging those around us to hold themselves to higher standards. Moreover, systems of accountability are crucial. Just as individual reflection and mindfulness are necessary for personal growth, collective accountability is necessary for societal progress. Whether through legal frameworks, ethical standards, or social movements, we must hold institutions accountable when they perpetuate harm. This requires both internal self-awareness and external vigilance. If the Lucifer Effect teaches us anything, it is that we are all capable of more than we imagine, but the capacity for good is just as powerful as the potential for evil. If we want to live in a society where goodness prevails, we must actively create that environment, not just for ourselves, but for everyone we interact with. This includes pushing back against toxic systems, standing up for what's right, and encouraging others to do the same. Building a culture of compassion and accountability. To undo the damage caused by systems of power, we must create cultures of compassion, mutual respect, and collective responsibility. Start by fostering an environment where open dialogue is encouraged, where people feel safe enough to admit their mistakes and question their actions. Support those around you who are on their own journeys of self-reflection, and be brave enough to challenge those who seek to dehumanize others, even when it is uncomfortable. Recognize that real change happens through continuous, everyday actions, not through sweeping reforms that are disconnected from lived experiences. This is how we heal, by recognizing that our choices impact not just ourselves, but everyone around us, by understanding that systems of power can only be dismantled when we collectively decide to stop feeding into them, and by realizing that the path from goodness to monstrosity is not inevitable, but it is something that requires vigilance, awareness, and a willingness to question the status quo. Change, then, begins not with grand declarations, but with the small, everyday decisions we make. From how we treat others to the systems we choose to support, we have the power to shift the collective moral compass. In this journey, remember, you are not alone. We are all in this together, and together we can choose to be something greater than the sum of our flaws. Together we can choose to be a force for good. What happens when we ignore this slow descent into darkness? What becomes of a person who once carried good intentions, but whose choices, compromises, and justifications have led them far from their original self? The transformation is rarely loud. It does not explode into our lives with fanfare. More often, it settles in quietly, like a fog that clouds judgment and numbs the soul. A once kind heart begins to rationalize unkindness. A person who valued honesty begins to lie by omission. And over time, this slow erosion creates a psychological dissonance so painful that the mind begins to protect itself, not by changing course, but by doubling down. The personal cost of moral collapse is immense. At the level of the self, it creates an internal fracture, a split between the person we are and the person we once imagined ourselves to be. This rupture gives birth to shame, but not the kind that corrects behavior. It is the kind that corrodes the spirit, feeding on secrecy and denial. Shame, when unacknowledged, festers. It turns outward. It becomes blame, resentment, cynicism. A man who once believed in justice becomes bitter toward those who still do. A woman who once fought for compassion now mocks it as weakness. Why? Because seeing goodness in others becomes unbearable when we can no longer find it in ourselves. This internal disintegration often spills into relationships. Trust erodes. Intimacy collapses. it becomes difficult to be fully seen when parts of us are hidden, even from ourselves. Partners feel a growing distance. Friendships become performances. The people around us sense that something has changed, even if they can't name it, and slowly we begin to isolate. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally, spiritually. The soul begins to hunch in on itself, protecting the guilt it cannot face. This emotional fallout also distorts our perception of others. When we lose touch with our inner integrity, we often project that loss onto the world. We begin to assume the worst in people, to expect betrayal, manipulation, cruelty. We live in constant defensiveness, because on some level, we are no longer aligned with truth, and so we stop trusting anyone else's. The damage does not stop at the personal level. It ripples outward into families, workplaces, communities. When those with influence or authority succumb to moral disengagement, they normalize it for others. A toxic boss creates a toxic team. A corrupt leader creates a corrupted institution. The standard of what is acceptable shifts, and once it shifts, it rarely moves back on its own. In organizational psychology, this phenomenon is often called ethical drift, the slow shift in group norms that allows unethical behavior to become routine. A team that once prided itself on transparency begins hiding inconvenient truths. A society that once valued fairness begins rewarding cruelty under the banner of efficiency or tradition. Over time, these shifts become culture, and culture, once set, is hard to unmake. This is how entire systems fall, not in a single catastrophic moment, but through countless small decisions made by individuals who once considered themselves good. The real danger is not the lone villain. It is the silent majority who turn their gaze, rationalize their silence, or follow orders without question. History offers countless examples. In Nazi Germany, most of the atrocities were not committed by fanatics, but by bureaucrats, doctors, soldiers, and citizens. Ordinary people. Many of them loved their families. Many believed they were doing their duty. But their moral compass had been recalibrated by ideology, fear, and repetition. The same pattern emerged in Stalin's purges, Mao's Cultural Revolution, the Rwandan genocide, the Yugoslav wars. Each time, the mechanism was eerily similar. Dehumanize the target, exalt the group, reward obedience, punish dissent. And always, always, there were those who looked away. But we need not look to history books alone. Even in our modern, civilized world, we witness the consequences of moral blindness every day. In the workplace, employees witness harassment or fraud and remain silent, fearing backlash. On social media, people spread hate or misinformation under the illusion of righteousness. In politics, entire parties align with corruption out of tribal loyalty, willing to sacrifice truth for belonging. The emotional cost is not just external. Even those who profit from their dissent often carry invisible scars. There is a reason many war criminals, years later, report dreams haunted by the faces of their victims. There is a reason dictators grow paranoid, surrounded by wealth but consumed by fear. Somewhere, buried beneath layers of denial and justification, the human soul remembers what it once was. Because the self is not so easily silenced. Even when we drown it in ideology or ambition, it whispers. It shows up in sleepless nights, in chronic anxiety, in the haunting sense that something has gone terribly wrong. This is not punishment. This is conscience, calling us home. And yet, we must be careful not to frame this journey only as tragedy. There is also profound hope here, because the same psyche that can fall into darkness can also return to light. The same mechanisms that allow us to justify harm can, if reversed, become tools of healing. The key lies in awareness. As soon as we begin to notice our own dissonance, as soon as we feel that tug of conscience, the descent slows. As soon as we name our discomfort, our guilt, our unease, we regain the ability to choose differently. The shadow, once acknowledged, loses its power to control. This is why confession exists in so many traditions, not as humiliation, but as liberation. To speak the truth about our wrongs, to look at them without flinching, is the beginning of freedom. Not because it erases the harm done, but because it reawakens the part of us that knows we can do better. Redemption is not found in perfection. It is found in the willingness to face ourselves, to own our missteps, and to walk back toward wholeness. This journey is not linear. It is often painful, but it is possible. And the sooner we understand the real consequences of ignoring our own dissent, the fractured identity, the shattered trust, the cultural decay, the more urgently we will seek to stop it, in ourselves and in others. Because what the Lucifer Effect teaches us, in the end, is not that people are secretly monsters. It teaches us that people are profoundly shaped by their context, their choices, their awareness, and that within each of us lives both the potential for cruelty and the capacity for compassion. Which one wins depends not on who we are, but on who we choose to become. If the path from goodness to monstrosity is a slow, unconscious descent, then the return journey must be conscious, deliberate, and compassionate. The question is no longer just why good people do bad things, but how we begin to reclaim our humanity when the systems around us, and sometimes even our own instincts, push us toward darkness. Transformation begins not with grand gestures, but with a quiet shift in awareness. A willingness to pause and look, not outward at others but inward at ourselves. And this in itself is an act of courage, because self-honesty is painful. It asks us to confront not just our regrets, but our capacity to deceive, to harm, to betray our own values. But that confrontation is also the beginning of freedom. To walk back from the Lucifer Effect is not to become perfect, but to become fully human, flawed but aware. So where do we begin? 1. Build a daily practice of moral reflection. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." In today's language, this becomes a call for moral journaling, a daily space where we examine not just what we did, but why we did it. This is not about shame or guilt. It's about alignment. Did I speak up when I saw something wrong today? Did I stay silent out of fear or fatigue? Was I kind because it was easy, or even when it was hard? When done consistently, this practice acts as an anchor. It protects us from drifting too far from our center. It also reveals patterns, the small ways we justify, avoid, or rationalize, and gives us the awareness to correct them. 2. Reconnect with your shadow. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is not something to be destroyed, but something to be integrated. If we suppress our darkness, it gains power. But if we bring it into the light, through therapy, creative expression, or honest dialogue, it loses its grip. Try this. When you feel disproportionate anger, resentment, or judgment toward someone, ask yourself, what part of me am I projecting onto them? What quality in them mirrors something I deny in myself? Journaling around these moments can reveal powerful insights. They turn conflict into self-discovery. They also reduce the tendency to dehumanize others, because we begin to see that what we fear in them lives, in some form, within us. 3. Use the power of pause. One of the most practical tools comes from mindfulness. The pause. Before reacting, before judging, before obeying, pause. Even a single breath between impulse and action can disrupt the unconscious chain reaction that leads to harm. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Train yourself to find that space. Meditation helps. So does breathing. So does walking away when emotions are high. You do not owe anyone an immediate reaction. Sometimes the wisest thing we can do is not act until we have returned to our center." 4. practice moral imagination. The Stoics asked us to rehearse hardship. The Sufis asked us to walk in the shoes of the other. Today, we can call this moral imagination, the ability to empathize with those we are tempted to dismiss or condemn. One powerful exercise is this. When you see someone you judge harshly, online, in the news, in your family, imagine their childhood. Imagine the pain they never spoke of, the losses they buried, the fear behind their cruelty. This doesn't excuse harm, but it humanizes the person behind it. And that humanity is what keeps us from becoming what we hate. This is not softness. This is strength. It's easy to dehumanize. It takes moral courage to remain open, especially when we're hurt or angry. 5. Surround yourself with ethical mirrors. Environment shapes behavior. So curate yours. Seek out people who challenge your blind spots, not just affirm your ego. Spend time with those who hold themselves to high ethical standards, not because they are righteous, but because they are honest. Avoid echo chambers. Question leaders, even the ones you admire. Question yourself, especially when you're praised. Choose communities that reward self-awareness, not just performance. In ancient spiritual traditions, seekers were often assigned a murshid, a guide who pointed out their ego, their illusions, their shadows. Today, this role can be filled by a therapist, a mentor, a close friend with whom you share a mutual commitment to truth. 6. Engage in restorative acts. Nothing transforms guilt like service, not performative, check-the-box charity, but direct, meaningful acts of repair. If you've hurt someone, apologize. If you've been complicit in harm, take accountability. If you've stayed silent, speak. Restorative justice, a practice rooted in indigenous wisdom and now embraced by modern psychology, teaches us that healing comes through dialogue, responsibility, and amends. Not all wounds can be undone, but when we act from a place of sincerity and humility, we begin to restore the world and ourselves. 7. Anchor in timeless wisdom. Finally, draw from the well of tradition. The Stoics reminded us to live by principles, not by moods. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." The Taoists asked us to live in harmony with the flow of life, resisting neither darkness nor light, but moving with both toward balance. The Sufis taught that every soul contains both Pharaoh and Moses, the tyrant and the liberator, and our task is to awaken the part that leads us home. In modern terms, this means cultivating humility. It means staying teachable, even when we think we've arrived. It means remembering that morality is not a finish line. It's a path walked daily, with trembling hands and a clear heart. There is a strange kind of silence that settles in when we truly grasp the weight of the Lucifer Effect. It is not the silence of fear, but of recognition, the understanding that the line between good and evil does not run between nations, or ideologies, or belief systems, but straight through every human heart. And yet, this is not a reason for despair. In fact, it might be the most hopeful truth we can face, because if the potential for cruelty lies within us, so too does the potential for unimaginable kindness. If we are capable of descending into darkness, then we are just as capable of returning to the light. The key lies in remembering that morality is not fixed. It is something we must practice, not perform, not inherit, but cultivate. Daily, quietly, courageously. You will not always feel noble. There will be moments when bitterness feels justified, when silence feels safer, when conformity feels easier. And in those moments, it may seem as though the higher path is for someone stronger, braver, more enlightened than you. But the truth is, it is meant for you, precisely as you are. Because the battle for the soul is never won in grand gestures. It is won in ordinary choices made with extraordinary awareness. So pause. Reflect. Speak truthfully, even when your voice trembles. Question yourself, not to punish, but to stay awake. And when you fail, because we all do, return to your center without shame. Begin again and again. That, more than any rigid perfection, is the mark of someone walking the path back from the edge. History shows us what happens when good people remain silent, when empathy is dismissed as weakness, when systems reward obedience over conscience. But history also shows us something else. It shows us the power of the awakened individual, the whistleblower who speaks despite fear, the citizen who protects a stranger, the friend who holds up a mirror gently but firmly. These are the quiet warriors of morality, the ones who remind the world what it means to be human. You do not need to be a hero in the eyes of others. You need only to be faithful to the part of you that still remembers what's right. That part, the one that flinches at cruelty, that aches at injustice, that longs for something more honest, is not weakness. It is your compass. The question is not whether you've ever strayed from it. We all have. The real question is, will you return? Will you be the kind of person who notices when the drift begins? Will you recognize the subtle justifications, the quiet betrayals, the small silences that lead to larger ones? Because in a world where it's all too easy to become something we never intended, the most radical act is to remain, or become, deeply, fiercely human. That choice is still yours. If this message stirred something in you, a memory, a quiet discomfort, or even a sense of hope, don't let it pass like a shadow on the wall. Pause with it. Sit in the discomfort. Let it ask you questions you haven't dared to ask yourself in a while. We live in a world that rewards performance and punishes reflection. But if you want to grow, not just as a thinker, but as a person, you have to choose the path of conscious living. Not perfection, not virtue signaling, just awareness, just integrity. So here's your invitation. Start small, but start now. Open a journal tonight and ask yourself one question. Where in my life am I drifting from who I really want to be? Write the uncomfortable answers. Don't edit them. Don't justify them. Just look, then take one step. Apologize where you've stayed silent. Speak up where fear has held you back. Reconnect with the part of you that knows the difference between obedience and conscience. That part is still alive. Nurture it, and if this video resonated with you, share it. Someone you know is probably on that dangerous edge right now, rationalizing, conforming, forgetting who they are. Your voice might be the reminder they didn't know they needed. Subscribe if you want more content that goes beyond surface-level advice and dives into the deeper work. The inner shifts that lead to real transformation. This is a space for the brave, for the honest, for those ready to remember their humanity, not as an idea, but as a daily practice, because the world doesn't just need smarter people. It needs awake ones. Are you ready to walk that path?